The autumn wind rattled the windows of Margaret Chen's suburban home in Portland, Oregon, as she meticulously arranged the last of the dinner plates on her mahogany dining table. At 62, Margaret had hosted countless family dinners, but tonight felt different. Tonight carried the weight of unspoken tensions that had been building for months. The golden leaves outside painted the perfect backdrop for what should have been a warm family gathering. Margaret's son David was bringing his wife, of 3 years Jessica, for their monthly dinner, a tradition that had become increasingly strained since Jessica's promotion to senior marketing director at her tech company 6 months ago. Margaret smoothed her navy blue dress and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, and despite the stress lines around her eyes, she still carried herself with the dignity of someone who had worked as a high school principal for 30 years before retiring. The doorbell chimed at exactly 6 o'clock. Jessica always insisted on punctuality, something Margaret initially appreciated but had grown to see as another way her daughter-in-law tried to control every situation. Before we go on, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any content, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. "Mom, we're here," David's voice called through the door. Margaret opened it to find her son's familiar warm smile, but her heart sank slightly when she saw Jessica standing behind him, already scrolling through her phone. David, 35 and still carrying the gentle demeanor that had made him such a beloved elementary school teacher, gave his mother a tight hug. "The house smells incredible," he said, breathing in the aroma of Margaret's famous pot roast. "You've outdone yourself again." Jessica looked up from her phone just long enough to offer a brief, practiced smile. "Hi, Margaret. Thanks for having us." Her voice carried that polished corporate tone that never quite felt genuine in family settings. At 29, Jessica was undeniably successful. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her clothes impeccably chosen, and her confidence unmistakable. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her daughter-in-law saw these family dinners as an obligation rather than an opportunity to connect. "Please, come in," Margaret said, stepping aside. "Dinner's almost ready." As they settled into the living room, Margaret noticed Jessica's latest designer handbag, easily worth more than what Margaret spent on groceries in 2 months. It wasn't that Margaret resented Jessica's success, it was the way Jessica seemed to use it as a shield, keeping everyone at arm's length. "How was work this week, Jess?" Margaret asked, genuinely trying to engage. Jessica's fingers continued dancing across her phone screen. "Busy. We're launching a new product line next quarter, and the stakeholder meetings have been intense." She paused her typing just long enough to glance up. "You probably wouldn't understand the complexities, but it's quite demanding." David shot his wife a warning look, but Jessica had already returned to her phone. Margaret felt the familiar sting of being dismissed, but she forced a smile. "I'm sure it is, dear." The first subtle crack in Margaret's patience appeared as she watched Jessica prioritize her phone over conversation, but she pushed it down. This was her son's wife, and she was determined to make this work. During dinner, the conversation flowed primarily between Margaret and David, with Jessica offering occasional comments between her constant phone notifications. Margaret had prepared all of David's childhood favorites: the pot roast with rosemary potatoes, green bean casserole, and fresh dinner rolls that still steamed when broken open. "Remember when you used to help me make these rolls?" Margaret asked David, watching him butter one with obvious enjoyment. "I was terrible at kneading the dough," David laughed. "You were so patient with me." "You weren't terrible," Margaret protested. "You were just eager to eat them before they were finished baking." Jessica looked up from her phone with a slight smirk. "That sounds like David, always wanting the easy way out." The comment hung in the air for a moment. David's smile faltered slightly, but he didn't respond. Margaret felt her jaw tighten. There was something in Jessica's tone, a casual cruelty disguised as teasing. "David was actually quite persistent," Margaret said carefully. "He'd spend hours perfecting his baseball swing in the backyard, even when he was struggling in Little League. He never gave up on anything important to him. Jessica hummed non-committally, already distracted by another notification. As Margaret served the main course, she tried to steer the conversation toward lighter topics. David mentioned you might be planning a vacation soon. We're considering Europe, Jessica said, finally putting her phone face down on the table. Though with David's teacher salary, we'll have to be practical about our choices. The way she said practical made it sound like a dirty word. Margaret saw David's shoulders tense slightly, but he continued eating without comment. Europe sounds wonderful, Margaret said. Your father and I honeymooned in Italy, the most beautiful trip of our lives, even though we stayed in tiny hotels and ate more bread and cheese than proper meals.
Well, thankfully we won't have to rough it quite that much. The laugh. Margaret excused herself to the kitchen, prepare dessert, needing a moment to compose her. Standing over the chocolate she'd baked from scratch, she took deep breaths and reminded that families were complex. Marriage required adjustment period. Jessica was young, ambitious. Perhaps she just didn't know how to balance her career
relationships yet. But as she returned to the dining room with dessert plates, she overheard Jessica speaking quietly to David. Your mum tries so hard with these elaborate dinners. It's almost quaint, isn't it? Like she's still living in the 1950s. David's response was too quiet to hear, but Margaret saw him shift uncomfortably in his chair. The word quaint echoed in Margaret's mind as she set down the plates with perhaps more force than necessary. Dessert looks lovely, Jessica said brightly when Margaret returned, as if she hadn't just been mocking her efforts. Margaret served the cake, rich chocolate with homemade vanilla buttercream, and watched as Jessica took a small, polite bite before pushing the plate slightly away. Too rich for you? Margaret asked. Oh, I try to watch my sugar intake, Jessica said. It's terrible for your skin, and at my age, you have to start being more careful about these things. The implication was clear. Margaret, at 62, was beyond caring about her appearance. Another small cut, delivered with a smile. As the evening progressed, Margaret began to see a pattern in Jessica's behavior. Every compliment came with a subtle barb. Every conversation somehow circled back to her superior position or lifestyle. It wasn't overt enough for David to call out, but it was constant enough to feel intentional. When Jessica excused herself to the bathroom, David leaned toward his mother. I'm sorry she's been a bit distracted tonight, he said quietly. Work's been really stressful lately. Margaret studied her son's face, seeing the strain he was trying to hide. How are you doing, sweetheart? Really? David glanced toward the hallway where Jessica had disappeared. I'm fine, Mom. Just adjusting to her new position. It's demanding, and sometimes she brings that energy home with her. But Margaret could see it was more than that. Her son, who had always been confident and outgoing, seemed diminished somehow, like he was constantly walking on eggshells, trying not to disappoint or embarrass his wife. When Jessica returned, she had fresh lipstick applied and her phone in hand again. I hate to cut this short, but I have an early conference call tomorrow morning. We should probably head out soon. It was only 8:30. Margaret's dinners used to stretch until 10 or 11, filled with stories and laughter and genuine connection. Now they felt like rushed obligations, checked off Jessica's list of wifely duties. As they prepared to leave, Jessica hugged Margaret with the same professional efficiency she seemed to apply to everything else. Thanks for dinner. The pot roast was nostalgic. Another backhanded compliment. Margaret was beginning to wonder if Jessica even realized she was doing it, or if it had become such a habit that the condescension was automatic. After they left, Margaret sat in her kitchen, staring at the stack of dishes and the barely touched slice of cake on Jessica's plate. She thought about her own daughter-in-law relationship with David's father's mother, how they'd built genuine friendship over the years through patience and mutual respect. This felt different. This felt like a war of attrition, where Jessica's weapons were her success, her youth, and her ability to make Margaret feel outdated and irrelevant. And what hurt most was watching David, caught in the middle, slowly losing pieces of himself as he tried to keep everyone happy. Margaret Chen had raised her son to be kind, respectful and strong. She'd taught him to value family, tradition and genuine connection over material success. But watching him tonight, she wondered if those lessons were being slowly erased by someone who saw them as weaknesses rather than strengths. As she loaded the dishwasher, Margaret made a decision. She wouldn't let this continue unchallenged. She loved her son too much to watch him disappear into someone else's shadow, but she also knew that direct confrontation would only drive David away and give Jessica ammunition to paint her as the interfering mother-in-law. No, this would require strategy, patience, and perhaps a little bit of the steel that had helped her manage hundreds of teenagers over 3 decades as a principal. The next family dinner was 3 weeks away. Margaret began planning immediately. 3 weeks later, the November rain drummed against Margaret's windows as she prepared for another family dinner. But this time, she had done her homework. In the days following the last dinner, Margaret had quietly reached out to David more frequently. Casual phone calls, text messages asking about his day, invitations for coffee that he politely declined because Jessica preferred they spend their free time together. Each conversation revealed a little more. David's voice had lost some of its natural enthusiasm. He mentioned being tired more often. When Margaret asked about his students or his photography hobby, something he'd been passionate about for years, his responses were brief and lacking the joy they once held. The most telling moment came when Margaret mentioned seeing an exhibit of nature photography downtown and suggested they visit together. David's immediate response was excitement, followed quickly by, "I'd have to check with Jess about our schedule." When had her independent, thoughtful son started requiring permission for a simple afternoon with his mother? Margaret had also done something she never thought she'd do. She'd looked up Jessica's social media profiles. What she found there painted a picture of someone obsessed with image and status. Every post was carefully curated to showcase an enviable lifestyle. Pictures of expensive restaurants, designer clothes, and exotic weekend getaways. David appeared in these photos, but always in a supporting role, holding Jessica's purse while she posed or cropped partially out of frame. Most disturbing were the comments Jessica made on her friends' posts. When someone shared news of a promotion, Jessica would congratulate them while subtly mentioning her own superior position. When friends posted about family gatherings, Jessica would comment about how blessed she was to have elevated herself beyond such simple pleasures. The picture that emerged was of someone who measured her worth entirely by comparison to others, always needing to be above, better, more successful. Margaret began to understand that Jessica's treatment of her wasn't personal. It was simply how Jessica related to anyone she perceived as beneath her status. Armed with this knowledge, Margaret planned tonight's dinner with careful precision. At exactly 6 o'clock, David and Jessica arrived. This time, Margaret was ready for Jessica's particular brand of subtle warfare. "Margaret, lovely to see you again," Jessica said, her voice carrying that familiar note of condescension disguised as warmth. "I brought wine, something I picked up at this little boutique in Napa. Probably more sophisticated than what you usually have, but I thought it might be nice to elevate tonight's meal." The insult was wrapped in the gesture of bringing a gift, making it nearly impossible to address directly. But Margaret had spent 30 years dealing with passive-aggressive teenagers and their parents. She recognized the tactics. "How thoughtful," Margaret replied smoothly. "I actually selected a wine myself tonight, something special I've been saving, but we'll certainly compare them. It'll be interesting to see which pairs better with the meal." Jessica's smile flickered slightly. She wasn't used to her offerings being treated as one option among many, rather than an obvious improvement. As they settled in the living room, Margaret noticed Jessica was dressed even more expensively than usual, a silk blouse that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, paired with jewelry that caught the light with every gesture. "You look lovely, Jessica," Margaret said genuinely. "That blouse is beautiful." "Thank you," Jessica replied, then added with a laugh, "I actually picked it up on my last business trip to San Francisco. The boutiques there have such incredible pieces, probably not available in Portland, but I have contacts who can get me access to exclusive collections." There it was again, the need to establish superiority even when receiving a compliment. Margaret simply nodded and smiled. During dinner, Margaret served her famous lasagna, a recipe that had taken her years to perfect. She watched as Jessica took a small bite, chewed thoughtfully, then reached for her water glass. "It's quite rich," Jessica commented. "I'm usually more careful about heavy foods. They're so bad for your digestive system. But I suppose comfort food has its place." The implication was clear. This was peasant food, suitable for people who didn't know better. David shot his wife a sharp look this time, clearly recognizing the insult even if he wouldn't address it. "I'm glad you're comfortable enough here to enjoy comfort food," Margaret replied evenly. "That means I'm succeeding as a hostess." Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't used to her subtle digs being deflected so gracefully. As the meal progressed, Jessica continued her pattern of backhanded comments. The dining room was cozy, too small. The family photos were sentimental, outdated. Margaret's stories about her teaching career were sweet, irrelevant. But Margaret had a plan, and she executed it with the patience of someone who had spent decades managing difficult personalities. When it came time for wine with the main course, Margaret brought out 2 bottles, Jessica's expensive Napa selection and her own choice, a modestly priced but excellent Oregon Pinot Noir from a local vineyard. "I thought we could do a little comparison," Margaret said cheerfully. "I'm curious to try your selection alongside this local favorite." She poured both wines, making sure to use her best crystal glasses, the ones that had been her mother's wedding gift, elegant but not ostentatious. Jessica immediately reached for her own wine, taking a sip with the air of someone performing for an audience. Yes, this has the complexity you'd expect from a premier vineyard. The terroir is quite distinctive." Margaret tasted both wines thoughtfully. Jessica's choice was indeed excellent and expensive, but Margaret's Oregon wine was also lovely, with a different character that complemented her lasagna beautifully. "They're both wonderful," Margaret said. "Yours has such sophisticated notes. I can taste why you selected it. And this local one has an earthiness that really brings out the herbs in the lasagna. Isn't it amazing how different wines can highlight different aspects of a meal?" Jessica's expression suggested she hadn't expected her wine to be treated as merely one good option among many. In her world, expensive automatically meant superior, and superior meant others should acknowledge their inferiority. "Well," Jessica said with a slight laugh, "I suppose if you're not used to wines of this caliber, the local ones might seem adequate by comparison." Margaret felt David tense beside her, but she remained calm. "Actually, I've been quite lucky to taste wines from all over the world during my travels. Robert and I visited quite a few wine regions during our marriage. This Oregon wine reminds me of a lovely Burgundy we had in France. Different grapes, of course, but that same sense of place and terroir you mentioned." It was a gentle reminder that Margaret's life had included sophistication and travel, even if she didn't need to advertise it constantly. Jessica's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. As they moved through the meal, Margaret began to notice something interesting. Every time she failed to react to Jessica's condescension with hurt or defensiveness, Jessica escalated slightly. It was as if she needed to prove her superiority, and Margaret's calm confidence was threatening that need. When Margaret mentioned a book she was reading, a critically acclaimed novel that had just won a major literary prize, Jessica dismissed it as the kind of thing book clubs choose when they want to feel intellectual. When David complimented his mother's cooking, Jessica added, "Margaret certainly knows her way around traditional recipes. Not everyone needs to experiment with modern techniques." When Margaret shared news about a former student who had become a successful artist, Jessica responded, "Teaching must be rewarding in its own way. I mean, it's not about personal achievement, but you get to live vicariously through others' successes." Each comment was designed to diminish Margaret's accomplishments, to position Jessica as inherently superior due to her corporate success and modern lifestyle. But Margaret had dealt with bullies before, and she recognized the insecurity beneath the aggression. The turning point came during dessert. Margaret had made her signature tiramisu, a recipe she'd learned during that honeymoon trip to Italy that Jessica had dismissed. As she served it, Jessica made her most pointed comment yet. "Tiramisu," she said with a laugh. "How wonderfully retro. I haven't seen anyone make this since the 90s. It's like a time capsule of dinner party desserts." The laugh that followed was light and social, but Margaret heard the cruelty underneath. This wasn't just about dessert. It was about positioning Margaret as hopelessly outdated, someone whose efforts were quaint at best and pathetic at worst. David had clearly had enough. "Jess, what's wrong with you tonight? Mom spent all day—" "It's fine, David," Margaret interrupted gently. She looked directly at Jessica with calm, steady eyes. "I'm curious, Jessica. You seem to have very strong opinions about traditional approaches to cooking, family dinners, even wine selection. I'm wondering, what does success look like to you?" Jessica blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct question. "What do you mean?" "Well, you've achieved so much professionally, and you clearly have sophisticated tastes and high standards. I'm just wondering what drives that, what success means in your life." It was a simple question, but it cut through all of Jessica's defensive positioning. For the first time, all evening, she seemed genuinely uncertain how to respond. I believe in excellence," Jessica said finally, "in not settling for mediocrity just because it's comfortable or familiar." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "That's admirable. Excellence is important. I always tried to teach my students that doing your best was more important than being the best, but I can see how those might seem like different philosophies." "They are different," Jessica said, gaining confidence. "Your generation was taught to be satisfied with good enough. My generation understands that if you're not moving forward, you're falling behind." "Interesting perspective," Margaret replied. "And yet here you are, choosing to spend your Friday evening at a traditional family dinner with traditional food and traditional conversation. I'm curious why you choose to be here if it represents something you've moved beyond." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jessica's mouth opened and closed, clearly, struggling to find a response that didn't reveal the contradiction in her position. David was staring at his wife with an expression Margaret had never seen before, like he was seeing Jessica clearly for the first time. David is important to me," Jessica said finally, "even if his family's lifestyle is different from what I'm used to." The words, "his family," hung between them. Not our family, not my family, his family, something separate from her, something she was graciously tolerating. Margaret felt a surge of protective anger, not just for herself, but for her son, who was watching this exchange with growing understanding of how his wife really saw his life, his background, his mother. "I see," Margaret said quietly. "Well, I appreciate your honesty." But Jessica, perhaps sensing she'd gone too far, tried to backtrack. "I mean, it's lovely that David has such a close relationship with you. It's just different from what I'm used to. My family isn't as involved in each other's lives." "Different isn't better or worse," Margaret said evenly. "It's just different." "Of course," Jessica agreed quickly, but her discomfort was obvious. As the evening drew to a close, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. David was quiet, clearly processing what he'd witnessed. Jessica seemed eager to leave, perhaps realizing that her usual tactics hadn't worked and might have actually backfired. At the door, Jessica's goodbye was briefer than usual. Her smile, more strained. David hugged his mother longer than he had in months. "Thank you for dinner, Mom," he said quietly. "The tiramisu was incredible, just like when I was a kid." After they left, Margaret sat in her kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of the evening. She felt drained, but also strangely hopeful. For the first time, David had seen his wife's behavior clearly, without Margaret having to point it out or create drama. But Margaret also knew this was far from over. Jessica would likely view tonight as a defeat, and in Margaret's experience, people like Jessica didn't handle defeat gracefully. They escalated. The question was, what would Jessica do next? The call came on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the dinner. Margaret was in her garden, preparing her roses for winter when her phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, but when she answered, his voice sounded strained. "Mum, can we talk? I mean, really talk?" "Of course, sweetheart." "What's wrong?" There was a long pause. "I think I need to come over. Alone. Is that okay?" Margaret's heart both lifted and sank. Lifted because her son wanted to confide in her. Sank because she knew what this conversation would likely be about. "I'll put the coffee on," she said. An hour later, David sat at Margaret's kitchen table, looking older than his 35 years. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "I've been thinking about dinner the other night," he began, staring into his coffee cup. "About the way Jess talked to you, about the way she talks about everything, really." Margaret waited, knowing he needed to work through this himself. "I keep trying to tell myself she's just stressed, or that her work environment is competitive, and it bleeds into our personal life. But Mom," he looked up at her with pain in his eyes, "I don't think that's it anymore." "What do you think it is?" Margaret asked gently. David was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think she sees you, sees my whole life before her, as something she has to overcome, rather than something she can be part of. Like marrying me was a renovation project, and everything about my background needs to be updated or replaced." Margaret felt her heart break for her son, but she was also proud of his insight. "How long have you felt this way?" "Longer than I want to admit," David said, "but I kept making excuses. When she discouraged me from coming to see you as often, I told myself she just wanted us to build our own traditions. When she rolled her eyes at my photography or suggested I find a more lucrative hobby, I thought she was just being practical. When she started correcting the way I spoke in front of her friends, I figured she was helping me fit into her world. And now?" David ran his hands through his hair. "Now I realize she wasn't trying to help me fit in. She was trying to make me into someone else entirely, someone she wouldn't be embarrassed by." The pain in his voice was raw and real. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "What happened to make you see this clearly?" she asked. David's laugh was bitter. "After dinner the other night, Jess spent the entire drive home telling me how disappointed she was in me. How I should have supported her more when you were challenging her. How embarrassing it was that I let my mother make her look bad." Margaret felt anger rise in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. "How did you respond?" I asked her what you had done that was so terrible, and she couldn't give me a straight answer, just kept saying you were being passive-aggressive and manipulative. "But Mom, all you did was treat her like an equal instead of like royalty, and she couldn't handle it." David paused, gathering courage for what came next. Then she said something that really opened my eyes. She said that if I was going to choose my old family over my new family, maybe we needed to reconsider our priorities. Margaret's blood ran cold. "She asked you to choose?" "Not in so many words, but yeah. And the thing is, Mom, I realized I've been choosing her over everything else for 3 years now. I stopped coming to see you as much. I gave up photography because she said it was a waste of time. I even stopped hanging out with my teaching friends because they weren't ambitious enough for her taste." The pieces of David's gradual withdrawal over the past few years suddenly made sense to Margaret. It hadn't been natural drift or the normal adjustment of a new marriage. It had been systematic isolation. "I've lost myself," David continued, his voice breaking slightly. "And I didn't even realize it was happening. I just kept trying to be the man she wanted me to be, and somewhere along the way, I forgot who I actually was." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You're still you, David. You're still the kind, thoughtful, creative man I raised. You just got a little lost, that's all." "But what do I do now?" David asked. "I love her, Mom, or at least I love who I thought she was. But I don't know if that person ever really existed,
or if I just projected my hopes onto someone who was showing me exactly who she was from the beginning. It was a mature question, and Margaret was proud of her son for asking it. But she also knew this was his journey to navigate. "What do you think you should do?" she asked. David was quiet for a long time. "I think I need to have a real conversation with her. Tell her how I feel, what I've realized. Give her a chance to, I don't know, help me understand her perspective. Maybe we can work through this." Margaret nodded, though privately she doubted Jessica would respond well to David's newfound assertiveness. People who needed to maintain superiority rarely reacted positively when their control was challenged. "And if she can't or won't work through it with you?" Margaret asked gently. David's shoulders sagged. "Then I guess I'll have to decide if I can live with being someone I don't recognize for the rest of my life." They talked for another hour, with Margaret sharing stories from her own marriage, the compromises that had strengthened her relationship with David's father, and the differences between healthy growth as a couple and losing yourself in someone else's expectations. When David left, Margaret felt a mixture of hope and dread. Hope because her son was finally seeing his situation clearly. Dread because she suspected Jessica's reaction to his new awareness would not be gentle. She was right. The call came 3 days later, this time from Jessica herself. Margaret almost didn't answer. They had never spoken on the phone without David present, but curiosity won out. "Margaret, it's Jessica. I think we need to talk." Jessica's voice was crisp and controlled, but Margaret detected an undercurrent of barely contained fury. "Of course, dear. What about?" "I think you know exactly what about. David has been different since our last dinner, more distant, more questioning, and frankly, I think you've been poisoning him against me." Margaret felt her own anger rise, but she kept her voice level. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Jessica. What makes you think I've been doing anything other than being a supportive mother?" "Don't play innocent with me," Jessica snapped, her corporate polish finally cracking. "I saw what you were doing that night. All those little questions, all that fake interest in my perspective. You were trying to make me look bad in front of David." "I was trying to understand you," Margaret said honestly. "And I was trying to defend myself against what felt like a series of attacks on everything from my cooking to my lifestyle to my intelligence." "Attacks?" Jessica's laugh was sharp. "Margaret, I was trying to be polite about the fact that your whole aesthetic is completely outdated. I was trying to help you understand that there are better ways to do things now." The mask had finally slipped. No more pretense of politeness or family affection. This was Jessica's true opinion, delivered without the usual coating of false sweetness. "I see," Margaret said. "And you think David needs this kind of help too?" "David has potential," Jessica said coldly, "but he's been held back by small-town thinking and limited expectations. I've been trying to help him see what he could become if he applied himself properly. And what's that? Someone worthy of the life I can provide for him. Someone who doesn't settle for mediocrity just because it's comfortable." Margaret felt a surge of protective fury for her son. "Jessica, David isn't a project to be improved. He's a human being with his own values, talents, and dreams. The fact that those don't align with your definition of success doesn't make them invalid." "His dreams?" Jessica scoffed. "Taking pictures of trees and teaching children. Those aren't dreams, Margaret. They're cop-outs. They're what people do when they're too afraid to try for something better. They're what people do when they care more about making a meaningful contribution than accumulating status symbols," Margaret replied, her voice hardening. The silence stretched between them, crackling with hostility. "Let me be very clear," Jessica said finally. "David is my husband. My priority is helping him reach his full potential, not coddling him in some fantasy where his current life is enough. If you can't support that, then perhaps you need to step back and let him grow without your influence." "And if I don't?" Jessica's voice dropped to something that was almost a threat. "Then I think David will have to make some difficult choices about what's more important to him, his future or his past." The line went dead.
Margaret sat staring at her phone, finally understanding the full scope of what her son was dealing with. Jessica wasn't just dismissive or condescending. She was actively trying to separate David from anyone and anything that didn't serve her vision of who he should be. And she saw Margaret as the biggest threat to that project. Margaret had dealt with manipulative people before, but rarely with someone so calculated in their emotional warfare. Jessica was essentially holding David's marriage hostage, forcing him to choose between keeping his wife and maintaining any relationships or interests that didn't meet her approval. The next family dinner was scheduled for the following week. Margaret strongly suspected it would be the last one, regardless of how it went. Jessica would either use it to deliver a final ultimatum, or she would find an excuse to avoid it altogether. Either way, Margaret knew she needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Her son was finally seeing the truth about his marriage, but that didn't mean he was ready to act on it. And Jessica, feeling cornered, would likely escalate her tactics. Margaret spent the week planning, not just for dinner, but for what might be the most important evening in her relationship with her son. She had one chance to show David that he deserved better, not by attacking Jessica, but by demonstrating what genuine love and respect looked like. She just hoped it would be enough. The third Friday in November arrived with an early snowfall that transformed Portland into a winter wonderland. Margaret watched the flakes drift past her window as she prepared what she suspected might be the last family dinner for a very long time. She had spent the week since Jessica's threatening phone call in careful preparation, not just of the meal, but of her own resolve. At 5:30, her phone buzzed with a text from David. Running a few minutes late, Jess had to finish a conference call. Margaret wasn't surprised. In her experience, people who were planning to create a scene often arrived already agitated, using small inconveniences to justify their behavior. They arrived 20 minutes late, Jessica's heels clicking sharply on the porch as she strode ahead of David. When Margaret opened the door, Jessica's smile was brilliant and cold. "So sorry we're late," Jessica said, in a voice that suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "You know how it is when you have actual responsibilities to handle." The first shot across the bow, delivered before she'd even crossed the threshold. David winced visibly, but Jessica was already moving past him into the house. "No problem at all," Margaret replied evenly. "I know how demanding real estate can be." She watched Jessica's face carefully as she delivered the subtle correction. Jessica had said actual responsibilities, implying Margaret had none. Margaret had responded with real responsibilities, acknowledging Jessica's work while noting that it was in real estate, not the tech company Jessica had been implying for months. It was a small thing, but Margaret had done her homework. Jessica worked for a property development company, not the cutting-edge tech firm she allowed people to assume. Her title was impressive, but her industry was far more traditional than she liked to admit. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. "I work in development, actually. Urban planning and commercial real estate, though I suppose the distinctions don't matter much to people outside the industry." Another dismissal, suggesting Margaret was too simple to understand such sophisticated work. But Margaret had spent 30 years working with city planners and developers on school district expansions and budget negotiations. "Oh, how interesting," Margaret said genuinely. "I worked quite a bit with development teams during my time as principal. The Harrison Elementary expansion project was particularly complex, trying to balance community needs with zoning requirements and environmental impact studies. Fascinating work." Jessica's confidence flickered. She clearly hadn't expected Margaret to have relevant experience, much less to discuss it knowledgeably. As they settled into the living room, Margaret offered drinks. She had prepared 3 options: sparkling water with fresh cranberries, a local craft beer David enjoyed, and 2 wines. One expensive bottle she'd purchased specifically for tonight, and one of her reliable Oregon favorites. "I thought we might do another wine comparison," Margaret said pleasantly. I found this lovely Bordeaux that I thought you might appreciate, Jessica, given your sophisticated palate. Jessica's eyes lit up with interest, clearly pleased to have her expertise acknowledged. I'd love to try it. French wines really are superior to most domestic options. Margaret poured the Bordeaux first, then her Oregon selection. She watched as Jessica swirled the expensive French wine with obvious satisfaction, clearly assuming it would demonstrate her superior taste. "This is exceptional," Jessica announced after her first sip. "You can really taste the terroir. French winemakers have such a deep understanding of their craft." Margaret nodded appreciatively and tasted both wines. "It's lovely. And this Oregon wine has such interesting notes too. Different style entirely, but really well crafted." David, who had been unusually quiet since arriving, tasted both wines thoughtfully. "They're both good, but I actually prefer the Oregon one. It's got more character somehow." Jessica shot him a sharp look. "Character? David, you need to develop a more refined palate. The French wine is obviously superior in complexity and craftsmanship." "I guess I just like what I like," David said quietly, but Margaret heard something new in his voice, a subtle resistance to being corrected. During dinner, Margaret had prepared coq au vin, a French dish that required significant skill and technique. If Jessica wanted to play the sophistication game, Margaret would meet her on that field. "Coq au vin," Jessica said as Margaret served the dish. "How ambitious of you, Margaret." The word ambitious was delivered with just enough emphasis to suggest it was beyond Margaret's capabilities. But as Jessica tasted the dish, her expression changed. The chicken was perfectly tender, the sauce rich and complex, the flavors beautifully balanced. This wasn't the simple comfort food she'd been expecting to dismiss. "It's quite good," Jessica admitted reluctantly. "Though I had an incredible version at Le Bernardin last month that had some interesting modern touches." "I'd love to hear about those," Margaret said genuinely. "I learned this recipe during a cooking class in Lyon many years ago, but I'm always interested in how different chefs interpret classic dishes." Jessica launched into a detailed description of the restaurant dish, clearly trying to establish her greater culinary sophistication. But as she spoke, Margaret noticed David watching his wife with a new expression. Not admiration, but something closer to embarrassment. "Sounds wonderful," Margaret said when Jessica finished. "It's amazing how food can transport us, isn't it? This recipe always takes me back to that little cooking school, learning from Madame Dubois. She was 83 and had been teaching American tourists for decades. Such patience with us clumsy foreigners." It was a gentle reminder that Margaret's experiences were real and meaningful, not just inferior attempts at sophistication. As the meal progressed, Jessica continued her pattern of subtle put-downs, but something had shifted. Margaret's calm confidence and obvious competence were undermining Jessica's usual tactics. Worse, David was no longer providing his usual supportive murmurs when Jessica made her cutting comments. The turning point came during dessert. Margaret had prepared crème brûlée, another technically challenging dish that Jessica couldn't easily dismiss as quaint or simple. "Impressive," Jessica said as Margaret served the perfectly caramelized custards. "Though I have to ask, don't you find all this elaborate cooking a bit much? I mean, at our age, shouldn't we be focused on more meaningful pursuits than spending entire days in the kitchen?" The implication was clear. Margaret's efforts were frivolous, busy work, the domain of women who had nothing important to contribute to the world. David set down his spoon with more force than necessary. "Mom's cooking brings people together, Jess. She's been creating these amazing meals for family and friends for decades. How is that not meaningful?" Jessica's smile tightened. "I just think there are more efficient ways to show love than spending 12 hours making one meal." "Efficiency isn't everything," David replied, his voice gaining strength. "Some things are worth taking time with." Margaret felt a surge of pride for her son, but she also saw the danger in the moment. Jessica's mask was slipping, and David was finally pushing back. This was heading toward confrontation. "More wine," Margaret offered, reaching for both bottles. As she moved to refill Jessica's glass, Jessica made a comment that would change everything. "Honestly, Margaret, watching you fuss over these elaborate productions is almost painful. It's like watching someone perform for an audience that's already left the theater." The cruelty in the statement hit the room like a physical blow. Jessica had essentially called Margaret's life meaningless, her efforts pathetic, her very existence irrelevant. David went completely still. "What did you just say?" I heard what you said," David interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm asking if you realize what you just said." Jessica's eyes darted between David and Margaret, clearly realizing she'd gone too far. "I was just suggesting that Margaret might find more fulfilling ways to spend her time by calling her life meaningless." David's voice was rising now. "By suggesting she's performing for people who don't care." That's exactly what you said, Jess. And it's exactly how you've been treating my mother for 3 years." Margaret watched as the confrontation she'd been dreading finally erupted. But instead of feeling upset, she felt strangely calm. David was finally seeing Jessica clearly, and he was choosing to defend what mattered to him. "David, you're overreacting," Jessica said, her voice taking on a placating tone. "I was just having a conversation about lifestyle choices." "No," David said firmly. "You were being cruel, just like you're cruel about my teaching, my photography, my friends, and anything else that doesn't meet your standards of importance." Jessica's face flushed with anger. "Your teaching? David, you make $35,000 a year. You could be doing so much more with your life if I'd just become someone else entirely," David asked. "If I'd just abandon everything that makes me happy so I could make enough money to satisfy your image?" The argument escalated quickly from there, with Jessica's careful facade crumbling completely. Years of suppressed frustrations poured out as she finally said what she really thought about David's choices, his family, his values. "I'm trying to help you become the man you could be," Jessica shouted. "Instead of settling for this small, meaningless life." "Small?" David's voice was incredulous. "I teach children to read, Jess. I help them discover they're capable of learning and growing. I capture moments of beauty that might otherwise go unnoticed." "How is any of that small?" "Because it doesn't matter," Jessica snapped. "In 10 years, those children will forget your name. Your photographs will sit in boxes gathering dust. You'll have spent your whole life on things that disappear." Margaret felt her heart breaking for her son, but also swelling with pride as she watched him stand up for his values. "And what you do lasts forever?" David asked quietly. "You help rich people buy buildings so they can make more money. You optimize profit margins for property developers. In what world is that more meaningful than education or art?" Jessica's face went white with fury. "How dare you diminish my career? I've worked incredibly hard to get where I am." "I'm not diminishing your work," David said. "I'm asking why my work isn't equally valid just because it doesn't pay as much." The argument continued, with Jessica revealing the depth of her contempt for David's life choices, and Margaret finally understanding the full scope of what her son had been enduring. Every dream dismissed, every passion questioned, every value challenged until David had begun to doubt his own worth. Finally, Jessica played her ultimate card. "Fine," she said coldly. "If this is the life you want, if you want to stay a small-town teacher married to your mother, then maybe we need to reconsider our marriage." The threat hung in the air like a blade. For 3 years, it had been Jessica's most powerful weapon, the implied promise that David would lose her if he didn't conform to her expectations. But this time, something different happened. David didn't crumble or apologize or promise to change. Instead, he looked at his wife with something that might have been relief. "Maybe we do," he said quietly. Jessica clearly hadn't expected this response. "What?" "Maybe we do need to reconsider our marriage, because I'm realizing that I've spent 3 years trying to become someone you could love, and you've spent 3 years trying to convince me that who I actually am isn't good enough." "David, no, let me finish. I love you, Jess, or I love who I thought you were." But I can't spend the rest of my life apologizing for my values, my family, my choices. I can't keep shrinking myself to fit into your vision of who I should be. Margaret watched her son reclaim himself in real time, standing up for everything he'd been taught to value while refusing to be diminished by someone else's narrow definition of success. Jessica made one last desperate attempt to regain control. You're making a huge mistake, David. I'm offering you a life most people can only dream of. Success, travel, financial security. You're offering me your life, David corrected. But I already have a life. It might not be impressive enough for you, but it's mine, and I'm not giving it up anymore. The evening ended with Jessica storming out, leaving David and Margaret sitting in the wreckage of what had been a marriage built on fundamentally incompatible values. 3 months later, David moved back to his apartment downtown, closer to his school and his photography studio. The divorce was surprisingly amicable. Jessica was eager to move on to someone who better fit her vision of success, and David was relieved to stop pretending to be someone he wasn't. Margaret's family dinners resumed their former warmth, now including David's colleague Sarah, a fellow teacher who appreciated both his photography and his mother's cooking. The conversation flowed, naturally, filled with genuine interest rather than subtle competitions. One evening, as Margaret and David cleaned up after dinner, he paused in his dish drying. "Mom, I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For letting someone make you feel unwelcome in your own home, for choosing peace over principles for so long that I almost lost both." Margaret set down her dish towel and hugged her son. "You found your way back. That's what matters." "I almost didn't, though. I was so afraid of losing her that I was willing to lose myself instead." "But you didn't," Margaret reminded him. "When it mattered most, you chose authentically. You chose love over fear, values over image, meaning over money." David smiled, looking more like himself than he had in years. "I chose family." As they finished cleaning up, Margaret reflected on the lessons of the past year. Jessica had been right about one thing. Margaret's elaborate dinners were performances. But not for an audience that had left the theater, for an audience that mattered, for family who understood that love is spelled Time, that traditions create connection, that some things are worth preserving even when they're not efficient or modern or impressive to outsiders. The most meaningful victories, Margaret had learned, weren't won through confrontation or cleverness. They were won through patience, authenticity, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing your own worth, regardless of whether others recognize it. And sometimes they were won by simply refusing to let someone else's insecurity diminish your light. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Margaret Chen stood in her kitchen preparing for what had become a very different kind of family dinner. The May sunshine streamed through her windows, illuminating the fresh flowers David had brought from his garden, a hobby he'd rediscovered along with many other parts of himself. Tonight's dinner would include not just David, but also Sarah Mitchell, the fellow teacher who had gradually become more than a colleague. Margaret had watched their relationship develop with quiet joy, seeing in Sarah everything that Jessica had lacked: genuine warmth, respect for others, and an appreciation for the simple pleasures that made life meaningful. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock, and Margaret smiled at the familiar punctuality. But now it felt like eager anticipation rather than rigid control. "Mom!" David called as he entered, his voice carrying the lightness that had slowly returned over the past months. Behind him, Sarah carried a bottle of Oregon wine and a bouquet of peonies from her own garden. "Margaret, thank you so much for having me again," Sarah said, offering a genuine smile that reached her eyes. At 32, Sarah had the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing her own worth without needing to prove it to others. "The pleasure is mine, dear," Margaret replied, accepting the flowers. "These are beautiful. Did they come from your garden?" "My grandmother's peonies, actually. I've been trying to keep her garden alive since she passed last year. David's been helping me learn about soil pH and fertilizer schedules." Margaret glanced at her son, who was beaming with pride. Photography wasn't his only rediscovered passion. He'd also returned to gardening, something Jessica had dismissed as getting dirty for no reason. As they settled in the living room, the conversation flowed naturally. Sarah asked about Margaret's recent volunteer work at the Literacy Centre, showing genuine interest in the adult learners Margaret was helping. David shared news about his students' progress and some photographs he'd taken of the spring wildflowers in Mount Hood National Forest. "I've been thinking about entering some of them in the Portland Photography Festival," David mentioned casually. Margaret felt her heart swell. For 3 years, Jessica had convinced David that his photography was a waste of time. Now he was considering sharing his work with the world again. "That's wonderful," Sarah said enthusiastically. "The one of the trilliums in Morning Light is absolutely stunning. You have such an eye for capturing the perfect moment." Margaret watched the exchange with deep satisfaction. This was what encouragement looked like: specific, genuine, supportive, without being patronizing. During dinner, Margaret served lamb with rosemary from her garden, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread. The conversation ranged from Sarah's experiences teaching second grade to David's photography to Margaret's stories about her former students. "Mrs. Chen," Sarah said. She'd been trying to get comfortable with calling Margaret by her first name. "David told me about the student who came back to thank you after 15 years. That must have been incredibly moving." Margaret smiled, remembering. "Tommy Rodriguez. He was struggling so much in 5th grade, both academically and at home. I spent many lunch periods working with him, and his parents and I stayed in close contact. When he graduated from college, he came back to tell me I was the first person who believed he was smart. That's exactly why I became a teacher," Sarah said. "Those moments when you see a child realize their own potential, it's like watching someone discover they have wings." "Udi!" The metaphor was beautiful, and Margaret saw David reach over to squeeze Sarah's hand. This was a woman who understood the value of David's work, who shared his passion for education and growth. "Jessica never understood that," David said quietly, then paused. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't bring her up." "It's okay," Margaret said. "She's part of your history, and comparing experiences can help us appreciate what we have now." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "It must have been hard, feeling like your profession wasn't valued by someone so important to you." "It was," David admitted. "I started questioning whether I was just making excuses for not being more ambitious. But working with you this year, seeing how passionate you are about teaching, reminded me why I chose this path in the first place." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Her son was healing, rediscovering not just his passions, but his confidence in his choices. After dinner, as they lingered over coffee and Margaret's famous apple crisp, Sarah shared news that surprised everyone. "I've been offered a position as curriculum coordinator for the district," she said. "It would mean more money and potentially more influence on educational policy." "That's wonderful," Margaret exclaimed. "You must be thrilled." Sarah smiled, but there was hesitation in her expression. "I'm honored, but I'm not sure I want it. I love being in the classroom. I love working directly with children. The administrative role would mean giving that up for meetings and paperwork and budget discussions." Margaret saw David watching Sarah with admiration, and she understood why. Here was someone being offered conventional success and questioning whether it aligned with her true values. "What does your heart tell you?" Margaret asked. "To stay in the classroom," Sarah said immediately. "But my practical side keeps saying I should take the promotion. More money, more prestige, a chance to influence education on a larger scale." "There's no wrong choice," Margaret said gently, "but I've learned that prestige without passion leads to emptiness. If your heart is in the classroom, there might be ways to influence education from there too." David nodded enthusiastically. "You could mentor new teachers, develop innovative curriculum, maybe even write about your methods. Some of the most influential educators never left the classroom." Margaret watched. Sarah considered this, seeing the relief in her eyes as she was given permission to choose meaning over status. "You know what?" Sarah said. I think I'm going to turn down the promotion. I want to see what happens when I fully commit to being the best classroom teacher I can be. The conversation that followed was everything the dinners with Jessica had never been. Supportive, thoughtful, celebrating someone's authentic choice rather than pressuring them to conform to external expectations. As the evening wound down, Margaret found herself in the kitchen with Sarah while David loaded the dishwasher. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" Sarah said quietly. "Of course, dear. David mentioned that things were difficult with Jessica for a while. I hope you don't feel like you have to approve of me or anything. I know how important you are to him, and I don't want to create any pressure." Margaret turned to study this thoughtful young woman who cared enough about David's relationships to worry about his mother's feelings. "Sarah, you've brought my son back to himself. You celebrate his passions instead of trying to change them. You value the same things he values. If anything, I should be thanking you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I love him," she said simply. "Not who he could become or who I think he should be. I love him exactly as he is." "That's the only kind of love worth having," Margaret replied, pulling Sarah into a hug. Later, as Margaret cleaned up after they left, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. The family dinners that had once been sources of tension and pain were now highlights of her week. Her relationship with David was stronger than it had been in years, and she had gained not just a potential daughter-in-law, but a genuine friend in Sarah. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Margaret glanced at the caller ID and was surprised to see Jessica's name. "Hello, Jessica," Margaret answered cautiously. "Margaret, I hope I'm not calling too late." Jessica's voice sounded different, smaller, less confident than Margaret remembered. "It's fine. How are you?" There was a long pause. "I heard David is seeing someone new, a teacher from his school." Margaret wasn't sure how to respond to this, so she waited. "I also heard you've been having family dinners again." "The three of you. David brings Sarah sometimes." "Yes," Margaret confirmed carefully. Another pause. "Margaret, can I ask you something? And please be honest." "Okay. Did you ever think there was hope for David and me?" "Really?" The question surprised Margaret with its vulnerability. For the first time, Jessica sounded like someone seeking genuine understanding rather than trying to score points. Margaret considered her words carefully. "I think you and David wanted very different things from life. That doesn't make either of you wrong, but it made you incompatible. But did you think that I was wrong about everything?" Margaret heard something in Jessica's voice that might have been regret or even pain. "I thought you were trying to make David into someone he wasn't," Margaret said gently. "And I thought David was trying to become someone he wasn't to please you. That's not sustainable for anyone. I really thought I was helping him," Jessica said quietly. "I thought he was settling, wasting his potential. I thought if I could just show him what success looked like." "Jessica, can I ask you something now?" "Yes." "Are you happy? Really happy? Not just successful?" The silence stretched so long that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. "I don't know," Jessica finally whispered. "I have everything I thought I wanted, but I feel empty, like I'm performing a role instead of living a life." Margaret's heart unexpectedly went out to this young woman who had caused her family so much pain. It's never too late to change course. "But I don't even know what I actually want anymore. I've been so focused on achieving and advancing that I forgot to ask myself what would make me genuinely happy." "That's a good place to start," Margaret said, asking that question. They talked for another 20 minutes, with Jessica sharing fears and doubts she'd apparently never voiced before. She spoke about feeling pressure to constantly prove herself, about relationships that felt more like networking opportunities, about a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow within. "I owe you an apology," Jessica said finally. "And David too. I was cruel, and I was wrong. I let my own insecurities make me try to tear down everything that didn't fit my narrow view of success." "Apology accepted," Margaret said. "And Jessica, I hope you find what you're looking for." After they hung up, Margaret sat in her quiet kitchen, processing the unexpected conversation. She felt no satisfaction in learning that Jessica was struggling. Only sadness that it had taken losing David for Jessica to begin questioning her priorities. But there was also hope in the call. Jessica was finally asking the right questions, finally willing to look beyond surface success to deeper fulfillment. Maybe she would find her way to a more authentic life. 3 weeks later, Margaret received a wedding invitation that made her smile broadly. David and Sarah had decided to have a simple ceremony in Margaret's backyard, surrounded by the garden they'd all worked on together. The invitation was handmade, decorated with pressing from David's photography and Sarah's dried flowers. As Margaret planned for the wedding, a celebration of love built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine compatibility, she reflected on the journey that had brought them all here. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is refusing to enable their worst impulses. Sometimes love means standing firm in your own worth rather than diminishing yourself to make others comfortable. And sometimes the family dinners that seem the most difficult lead to the most important revelations. Margaret Chen had learned that protecting what matters most isn't always dramatic or confrontational. Sometimes it's as simple as consistently showing up as your authentic self and refusing to apologize for values that have stood the test of time. As she wrote her response to the wedding invitation, Margaret included a note, looking forward to many years of family dinners filled with love, laughter, and genuine connection. The cycle was beginning again, but this time built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared joy. And that, Margaret knew, made all the difference.